This is the Enleum AMP-23R. It is technically a speaker amplifier, but it also functions as a high-power headphone amp, and in fact it mostly seems to be talked about and bought by headphone users. It's not cheap, coming in at over $6,000, so let's see if it's worth the money. The first thing to notice, obviously, is just how good this thing looks. With a pristine build quality and finish that also extends to the all-metal remote, this is a product which you're not going to quickly get tired of looking at, and in fact you'll probably struggle to find almost anything to complain about the build quality here. On the front, the headphone output and controls are tucked on the right-hand side, and the volume control is not only perfectly smooth to turn with a very satisfying level of resistance, it's also motorized, so you don't need to be within arm's reach to turn things up or down. On the back, we have the left and right speaker outputs, two sets of selectable RCA inputs, and the N-Link inputs, which is a current mode transmission option available if you have an Enleum or Bakun source device. Enleum themselves doesn't actually have a DAC at the moment which has these outputs, but if you have a Bakun DAC with SATRI-Link outputs, you can use them with this. One other interesting build feature to mention is the vibration isolating feet. Whilst extra mild stuff like this is always nice to see on products, I would have preferred slightly if these feet had a bit more grip. The bare metal surface means that the amp has a tendency to slide around when you're plugging or unplugging things, and if you place it on a hard surface, it could potentially scratch your desk. You can just unscrew the feet to use something else if you'd like though, so it's not a massive issue, or you could just put a bit of rubber tape on the bottom, but it would be nice if the amp in its stock form didn't have this issue. So then, let's have a look inside. The 23R is using a bit more of an open plan type design in comparison to the 13R, which did have separate milled sections in the chassis for things like the transformer, for example. This transformer, which is from Avell Lindbergh, does also seem to have multiple windings. It's got some for the digital section, and it's got a separate set for the analog output section. So the digital and analog sections are separated. Over here, you can see that the 1/4-inch headphone output doesn't actually connect to a separate amplifier. There's no amplification circuitry on this PCB here. Instead, via this cable, it connects straight to the main amplifier itself. So unlike some speaker amps, which will connect the headphone output to either a separate amp entirely, or maybe to the main amplifier but with a resistor in series to attenuate the signal, this just connects the 1/4-inch headphone output straight to the main amp, so it's no different from connecting to the speaker tabs. There is a small microcontroller here which is responsible for things like controlling the volume control circuitry and tracking and adjusting the bias on the transistors. Which, on that note, you can see some fairly sizable transistors here, and whilst it is a headphone amp capable of about 5 or 6 watts at 32 ohms, because it's a speaker amp, it is also designed to handle considerably more current than that, and so it can go down to, I believe it's 40 watts at 4 ohms. These quite nice looking heatsinks are sat on top of Enleum's NSense circuit, which is their input circuit. I can't show you that, unfortunately, because it does seem that it requires removing just about everything in order to get access to those, so can't peek at that, unfortunately. This section here, with all these relays, is the actual gain adjustment, and you can hear those clicking when you turn the volume. This seems to be a very nice design. There's no fluff to it. It is a true zero feedback, single-ended Class A amp. But whilst there's not really much that I can complain about here, there's nothing to call out as being problematic, everything's very clean. The only thing I would say is that this is a $6,000 amp, and I wouldn't really say that the bill of materials cost is justifying that. There's some unique technologies in here which would have had some notable R&D costs. The N-Link inputs, the gain adjustment circuitry, the Jet 2 bias adjustment circuitry, but a lot of this was already developed in the previous 13R, so it wouldn't have needed to be done from scratch. It would have just been either borrowed straight from that or developed on the basis of that, and wouldn't have had as much of a significant R&D cost. And the parts themselves don't necessarily justify a $6,000 price tag. These capacitors are about $2.50 each, the microcontrollers also about $2.50, even the actual MOSFETs are about $8 each. So, excluding the chassis, which genuinely would have been very expensive to make, the machining on this could not have been cheap, and I imagine the chassis probably cost more than all of the internals. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. It's still a little bit tricky to see how you're getting to even a fraction of $6,000. I don't want to say too much on this because bill of materials is far from the only determining factor in how expensive a product genuinely needs to be in order for it to be viable. But I am a little bit surprised at what the overall build cost seems to be for a $6,000 price tag. The The volume control on the 23R is also working in quite a unique way. With most amplifiers, what happens is that the amplification stage has a fixed level of gain, maybe 2 or 3 settings. And gain is just a ratio of how much the incoming voltage from your DAC is multiplied. To do volume control, the volume knob just attenuates the voltage going into that amplification stage. The drawback of this is that the more you attenuate volume, the more dynamic range you lose. So what's the 23R doing differently? Well, when you adjust the volume on the 23R, it's not attenuating the signal going into the amplifier itself, it's actually changing the gain of the amp. It adjusts the gain continuously to use exactly what you need at all times, and in theory, therefore, keep dynamic range as high as possible at every level. This is a really cool design aspect that I would love to see in more amps in future, but there are some problems. I noticed that when I was listening and turning the volume up or down, I'd hear some clicks and pops, not just from the amp itself when the relays clicked, that's to be expected, but actually through the connected headphones. With hard to drive stuff like a Susvara, they weren't really a bother at all, but with sensitive stuff, they could get quite loud. And then when doing some objective testing on the 23R, I did find out what was going on here, and it could potentially be a little bit dangerous. So watch to the end of the video if you want to find out about that. But for now, let's talk about sound. This is an amplifier with some pretty unique design characteristics. Not just the gain control, but it's also a zero feedback amp, meaning it's using no negative feedback whatsoever. Negative feedback is a technique used by, well, most amplifiers to error correct and reduce distortion. It feeds some of the output signal back to the input, but inverted, so that when you sum those two together, any changes from the input signal, or any distortion, can in theory be cancelled out. Some amplifiers use just a little bit of negative feedback and some use vast amounts of it. But the problem is that whilst objectively speaking, generally, more feedback is going to make things more accurate. Subjectively, quite a lot of people find that amps relying on vast quantities of negative feedback, some of which even have op-amps nested inside the feedback loops of other op-amps, don't sound that great, with common reports being that they sound clinical, sterile, or thin. And that mirrors my experience too. I do find that quite a lot of the particularly op-amp based designs do sound quite a bit more sterile. And it's not necessarily just a case of it's more neutral and transparent and that's why it sounds like that. There's plenty of really well measuring gear, like a Hollow Bliss for example, which don't have those qualities. But whilst the complete absence of any negative feedback or other error correction is almost certainly going to lead to poor objective performance, it can lead to a subjective experience that many people really enjoy, often being described as lush, warm, or even tube-like. And in many ways, I'd really agree with that. This is a solid-state amplifier that both subjectively and objectively in many ways behaves like a tube amp. It does have quite prominent harmonic distortion, both with high and low impedance loads, but primarily second and third order harmonic distortion, rather than higher order harmonic distortion, which is more audible and less pleasant. The 23R is a very warm sounding amplifier, but it is far from being muddy. It is a very resolving and detailed amp. On tracks like Isaila's Only Girl in the Room, there is an effortlessness and crystal clear presentation to the leading edge and decay of each pluck of a string, plus a complete absence of any sense of congestion when there's multiple voices and instruments all playing at once. The level of information and resolution available here, particularly in the vocalist's voice, is among the best amps that I've heard. Usually with much warmer sounding amps, they do tend to fall into or close to that muddy category. That's the drawback. You sacrifice some raw technical performance, but that doesn't seem to be an issue here. You get that lushness, warmth, and a euphonic presentation with detail retrieval exceeding that of most other products. And the 23R is a pretty powerful device, and sounded quite fantastic with the likes of the Susvara and the Abyss 1266. Susvara in particular is a headphone that I find changes quite a bit in response to available power. And whilst the 23R doesn't deliver quite the same level of dynamic impact and grip on the drivers that a Ferrum Ore or a Hollow Bliss does, it's still better than most amps I've tried, and the differences are really starting to get quite subtle here. Put the Susvara on a Headamp GSX Mini, for example, and you're left with a fairly soft sounding result. That's an amp I love for other headphones, but with the Susvara in particular, it just doesn't really have the juice for them. But put the Susvara on the 23R, well, plug them in, put something punchy on, and enjoy. There is a lot that this amplifier is doing very, very well. Detail, separation, and background are absolutely top tier. It's got that warm, lush presentation without the drawbacks of many other warmer sounding amps. The timbre is not realistic, just because of the fact that this is quite a coloured sounding amp. It's coloured, but coloured in a very pleasant way that a lot of people are going to enjoy. So whilst not accurate timbre, it might be subjectively preferable to quite a lot of people to a more neutral sounding amp. And whilst this isn't the most punchy, impactful sounding amp just in terms of its inherent sound signature, it's still no slouch. And in fact, you can actually get quite a bit more of an impactful sounding result from this compared to a lot of other amplifiers when you're running hard to drive headphones. Because even though the inherent sound signature of this, which shows up more with easier to drive stuff, is a bit softer than a lot of other amps, with stuff like a Sesvara or a 1266, because this is driving them better than a lot of smaller, less powerful amps, you still get a harder hitting result. But there is one aspect in particular that I'm not particularly fond of and do find quite lacking on the 23R, and that's mid-range texture. This is a warmer sounding amp, and as such it focuses your attention more on the mid-range than a lot of other amps might do. And in many cases that's really enjoyable. I picked the song Only Girl in the Room by Asyla earlier because on this amplifier, overall, it sounds fantastic. But in that song, the primary vocalist is singing quite a bit higher than the backing vocalist. I'll play a little bit more of that for you now.
In the room, it could last forever, or it could all be gone.
In this part of the song, the lower vocals sound almost slightly smoothed over here, and if we play something a bit more mid-range heavy, like Sine Wave's A Ton of Automatons, this gets even more apparent. At about 40 seconds into that track, there's a range of things playing. There's some higher frequency synths which sound almost woodwind-like, there's some guitar, bass guitar, some percussion, and when you swap between the 23R and the Ferrum Ore, the resolution available in the drums, the higher frequency synths, and some of the guitar were pretty on par. Both of these amps are incredibly resolving and can show it off here. But when it comes to the lower frequency stuff like the bass guitar, or even just when some of the other elements started to play lower, the 23R started to feel a bit woolly and thick. Going to later in the song and about 3 minutes in, there's some other synths which again performed basically the same from a technical standpoint on both amps, just different in presentation due to the 23R being warmer. But all of the content that was lower in frequency was more clearly resolved on the Ore. It's not a difference that's likely to be obvious when just listening to the 23R by itself. It never sounded outright bad, but when comparing it to other amplifiers, it does on some songs hold it back from sounding as impressive as this amp can be with other content, to close to being mediocre. And this was my big issue with the 23R. If this was $2,000 or even $3,000, I'd probably be speaking quite a bit more positively about it. It's a nice option to have, this warmer sound signature, and something which the likes of a Ferrum Ore or Hollow Bliss can't offer you. But it doesn't always keep up with the Ferrum Ore in terms of detail retrieval, and at $2,000 or $3,000, that'd just be a preference choice. Are you happy to take a slight hit in technical performance and detail retrieval, in some tracks, for a sound signature that is maybe more to your tastes than competitors? But this isn't $2,000, it's over $6,000, and at that price I just don't think these caveats are all that acceptable. And hell, you're only a couple grand away from going for its ALHM1, which also has the ability to run with zero feedback and is objectively quite a bit higher performance when doing so, as well as in my opinion being significantly better subjectively. This review might surprise some people because, generally speaking, the feedback on the 23R has been very positive. The majority of the negative feedback that I've seen is from people who are comparing it to the original 13R from Bakun. A lot of them seem to say that the original 13R was better than this. I've not tried it, I can't speak on it, so this review is just of the 23R. Don't apply any of this to the 13R. It's a different product. But I'm definitely not the only one with complaints about the 23R. In fact, the owner of this very unit wasn't so fond of it either. And you can also go and watch my friend Koji at Convince Me Audio's review, where he had similar findings too. And just in case this may have just been a bad unit in some way, I did send a full set of measurements to the designer of the amp and asked if there was anything unexpected, and he said that everything looked normal. You can see the measurements on my website GoldenSound.audio if you're interested. If you're watching this video and you already have an AMP-23R though, one interesting thing I did find out when I was testing is that it performs its best with quite a bit lower than usual of an input signal. I always do my measurements after I've done my subjective listening. I don't want the measurements to bias what I'm hearing subjectively. So after I found that out, I did go back and listen again. I just turned my DAC down by 15 dB, and sure enough, it did sound a bit better. It's not a massive change or anything like that, but detail got a slight bump, and soundstage depth seemed to be the most noticeable improvement. So if you have an AMP-23R, I would recommend trying that. Just in your player, turn your volume down by 10 to 15 dB, or on your DAC directly if it supports it. And let me know what you think. And now we come to something a little bit concerning which anyone who already owns or is planning on buying a 23R should be aware of. Those clicks and pops that I mentioned earlier, that's usually an indication of DC offset. If your amp is outputting a very small level of DC current, so 1 millivolt or something for example, and when you change the gain, it jumps up to 2 millivolts, that causes an audible click in your headphones. But so long as the DC level isn't actually that high, it's nothing to worry about, it's just a minor annoyance. But too much of it could potentially pose a risk to connected equipment. So I connected the 23R to my analyzer and measured the level of DC output. At first, DC offset looks very low. I can play something through the amp and that doesn't change. But when I start turning up the volume, DC offset increases. It slowly goes back down to 0, but then turning the volume down again, DC offset goes the other way before again slowly returning to 0. And the faster you adjust the volume, the more DC you get. If I quickly turn the volume knob from 12 o'clock to minimum, it starts going to potentially dangerous levels of DC, and if I turn it all the way, it goes much higher. This means that if you adjust the volume on the 23R too quickly, say if you turn it down to minimum all of a sudden, you could potentially risk damaging your headphones. To be clear, I've not seen any reports of it damaging anything, nor has it damaged any of the stuff that I've got here, but it's just something that's a bit concerning and to be aware of, so just adjust the volume slowly, and hopefully this can be fixed in future revisions of the product. So, what's the summary then? The 23R is a beautifully built amp with a unique sound signature that's hard to find in other products and near impossible to find without giving up quite a lot of detail and technical performance. But whilst the performance of this amp in many ways is phenomenal, it is held back by a smoothing over effect that creeps in particularly with lower mid-range content. And for many people, the sound signature of this amp is going to be why they want it, and losing a bit of technical performance in comparison to, well, even much cheaper amps isn't a problem when those amps don't give them the sound signature that they're looking for, that warmth and lushness, in the first place. But for others, paying over $6,000 for an amplifier that falls behind even considerably cheaper ones in some areas isn't going to be acceptable. It is plenty powerful and drives difficult headphones like the Susvara with ease, but it may not be the best option and might even be risky to use with very sensitive headphones, so your pairing is going to be something to consider. But overall, I think this is an interesting amp. I just think that $6,000 is a lot to ask for it given the caveats, and personally I'd be much more inclined to go for something like a Ferrum or a Hollow Bliss and spend the $3,000 or so you've saved on a nice tube preamp. Using the Prima Luna Evo 400 into the Ferrum Or was in my opinion a much nicer result than just using the 23R standalone, although not as compact obviously. I'll tell you what though, I can hardly stop looking at this thing. It's probably one of the nicest built amplifiers on the planet. If you'd like to come and talk to me and other Wiggly Air enthusiasts about music, gear, or anything else at all, then join my Discord server, or support me on Patreon and join the private supporters-only Telegram chat. A huge thank you to my crazy Summit Fi supporters, Chief Big Time, Dan Mellinger, Jiden the Shiba, and Joe, my Legend tier supporters, Chris, CK Yozizawazu, and Gravitas, and my Diamond tier supporters, Naivotsu, Clockmeister, Desert Scrub, Ixnay, Yan R, Yaiwei Lee, Spellio Fool, Vincent Go, and White Sea Studio. A huge thank you to all of you, you are fantastic, and a big thank you to everyone else who is supporting me. I hope you enjoyed that video, I'll see you next time.